And I'm just going to be blunt. It means having less white people, having less Asian people, and lowering the standards. That's what it boils down to. Because it is racist for other groups of people to be a little bit more successful than other groups of people, and so therefore we need to lower the standard.
Welcome back to the For Liberty and Justice podcast, where we seek to mobilize the church, wake up the city, and take a stand for liberty and justice. I'm Joshua Moore, your host today. And remember, before we get into the show, hit the like button, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spotify, all the accounts, all the platforms that we're on, Instagram, share, like, and share and like, and do it over and over, rinse and repeat. We want to get the word out to people. We have an incredible episode today. We're going to be talking about DEI. Yes, you heard it, DEI. And we have a special guest today with us, Carlos Turcios. Carlos is part of Representative Nate Schatzline's staff, but also has worked with the Dallas Express and done a number of different initiatives. He's also a wonderful addition to our team here at For Liberty and Justice. So, Carlos, welcome to the episode.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Joshua, to be here and discuss, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I just want to jump, if you allow me.
Yeah, please do.
I just want to jump into how I was introduced to DEI. So I got involved in politics at the age of 15. And it wasn't through a campaign. It wasn't through, a city council election or, a congressional race. It was, ironically, it was through a school board protest, where the superintendent at that time in 2017 was trying to split up my school into two campuses. It was very controversial within my school. And that's when I learned, there's a superintendent, there's a school board president, there's a school board. I had no clue that there was something called a school board and that we actually elect these people. And I was 15 at the time. My parents also got introduced to that, and so did many other parents. We ultimately won that fight. But through that effort in 2017, there was a committee that was announced and that was actually being promoted called the Racial Equity Committee in Fort Worth ISD. And of course, as a 15-year-old, I had no clue what on earth equity was. I assumed it was just a committee that discussed scores and wanted to help out Fort Worth ISD and its schools. And so during those months of, fighting for my school and, of course, getting the superintendent to change his plans, I ultimately got to know the board president at that time. And the board president, appointed me to that committee. And I was there as a student representative. And keep in mind, I was a 15-year-old, and I was surrounded by like 40-something-year-old people and 50-year-old and 60-year-olds. Right. So it was, for me, I thought, oh, wow, this is a cool committee. This is a cool place where I can make, important decisions. I can help out my school and other schools in the city. The first meeting we discussed were scores, and it was scores from schools, scores between races and all that. And I was like, okay, that's fine. We're just trying to improve scores. That's fine. But by the third meeting is when we had a conversation about turning Texas blue. One of the professors from TCU, who was a member at that time, was talking about how Texas can be turned blue and how, the civil rights movement is one against systemic racism and all of this mumbo jumbo.
Right.
And that's when I realized, I don't know, something was weird. Because keep in mind, I was introduced into politics. I had no clue the dynamics of the Republican Party and Democrat Party. But when I heard that, and when I started listening to that, I was like, isn't this political? Isn't this like, aren't we not supposed to be talking about like partisan stuff and like just social justice activists and all this stuff? So ultimately, I discussed this to my science teacher and to my parents. And my science teacher at that time was telling me, oh, yes, Carlos, we've been dealing with this for a while. We're having to do trainings where Teachers are taught about their white privilege. They're taught about anti-racism and all of this stuff. And he ultimately gave me a lot of materials, and that's when my eyes opened wide, and I guess woke up and I realized, oh, this is a thing. Like, they're apparently training teachers and telling them that if you're white, you have privilege no matter what. And if you have a darker skin color, you are not privileged. Instead, you are deemed oppressed. And so, let's just say the entire experience was one where I learned about this thing called DEI, critical race theory. And through the conversations with my science teacher and my parents and other people, I ultimately did stay in the committee because no one else was concerned about what was happening. And I stuck around for a couple of years so that way I could go to the summits, I could go to the conferences and learn more about, okay, how are they embedding this in the schools? And, I actually rushed in wanting to expose this back in 2018 when I reached out to Chris Salcedo, and I pretty much told him, hey, Jacinto Ramos is telling kids that, you have to be Mexican first and, white people are evil. And Chris, at that time said that was not enough evidence for us to run a story because we were running a story like 2 years ago.
Right.
So I was very demoralized for a couple years because I ultimately went to State Representative Craig Goldman and presented some of those documents as well, alongside with a former school board trustee who was also concerned, and fun fact, was a Democrat. And she was also concerned about what was happening in Fort Worth ISD. And so went to him, nothing really happened, but I still, I persisted. I stayed in the committee. It wasn't until I graduated from high school, and it wasn't until 2021 that everything started to change. There was a huge conversation about critical race theory. Parents were getting concerned about this thing called critical race theory, and I was like, that's what I've been talking about all these years between 2017 and 2021. And so a lot of parents start to see that, lawmakers were talking about critical race theory. Former President Trump at that time was talking about critical race theory. And ultimately, I started to go around, houses and start to visit parents in Fort Worth ISD and show them all of the stuff I've gathered throughout the years. And they were like, I had no clue this was happening, and look what Superintendent Scribner is doing. He is sending a letter to the Texas lawmakers telling them not to support this critical race theory ban. So with all of that information and education, we were able to get people to go to the school board meeting in May of 2021 and show up and pretty much say, hey, we don't want this critical race theory stuff. We don't want this DEI stuff. This racial equity committee as well needs to go. And that's when the momentum started to blow up in Fort Worth ISD. And the next month, in June of 2021, we had 200 people show up at the school board meeting in Fort Worth ISD. You had like more than 100 speakers show up. And actually, Nate was there. He was one of the speakers as well. And I was so excited at that time because I finally realized it took 4 years. But through patience and prayer, God ultimately opened a door and people woke up. And so ultimately things started to happen things start to happen. And we got the co-chair of the Racial Equity Committee to resign late that year because she was exposed harassing parents and calling them white supremacists and cussing at them. And we ultimately got the Racial Equity Committee to shut its doors to the public, which sounds a little bit bad, but it actually helped our cause because it weakened them significantly because they couldn't do anything out in the public because they were so afraid of the backlash. Superintendent Scribner ultimately resigned. The Racial Equity Director, Sherry Breed, resigned in 2022. The fourth most radical school board member in the whole country in the Turning Point record, Jacinto Ramos, resigned as well that year in 2022. So a lot of changes start to happen, but because of that conversation, other parents, not just in Fort Worth ISD, but other school districts in Texas, started to talk about critical race theory, DEI. What is this? And when I would talk to parents about what DEI and critical race theory is really the understanding on how race plays in policy practices and government and society, essentially.
Right.
How does race play pretty much in day-to-day activities in your life? And that ties into this woke narrative of, racial consciousness, where this belief that if I am a Latino or a Black person or an Asian American, my conscious mindset every single day is, well, the neighbor that is white spoke to me in a aggressive tone, but the neighbor that is Black did not talk to me in an aggressive tone. So that is a sign of hatred from a white individual because they are racist inherently. And so racial consciousness is basically, how does my race, my identity, influence and impact my day-to-day activities, my relationships, my work activities, things like that. And I learned that concept through the Racial Equity Committee, because that's how woke it was.
Sure.
But things like that, white privilege, inherent, implicit bias, that apparently we have unconscious bias, that it doesn't matter how much training you have, you will always be racist and you will never know because you were just born that way. I mean, that's just how woke these individuals were.
Yeah.
But, things like that was embedded in the Racial Equity Handbook in Fort Worth ISD. It was embedded in the trainings that teachers had to do, and the emails that teachers ultimately got. That's ultimately changed a lot, and now with President Trump in the White House, that's definitely going to change. And with Senate Bill 12 becoming law and will be signed by Governor Abbott.
And what is Senate Bill 12?
So the Senate Bill 12 ultimately bans DEI in school districts in the state of Texas, but it also bans LGBTQ and gender ideology courses, programs, and clubs in schools. So essentially DEI in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And it will ban it altogether. So any DEI duties, they have to remove it. And Dallas ISD, ironically, you would expect Dallas ISD to be much more hostile and wanting to sue the Texas government.
Right.
But they actually are, they're already changing policies. We're going to scrap all of this. I actually visited their website yesterday, the Racial Equity Office website that they have, and it no longer exists. It just says page not found. And the trustees apparently have a proposed resolution to just scrap the whole thing and change and just comply with what President Trump is wanting to do. Fun fact, Fort Worth ISD has not stated anything whatsoever.
Oh, interesting.
Despite the fact that they've had, two superintendents over the past 3 years, and they face much more controversy, and the mayor is, a little bit more critical of Fort Worth ISD. I haven't seen any statement from them saying, we're planning to change and comply with what President Trump wants to do and removing DEI. I haven't seen anything.
Right. I think Fort Worth is such an interesting city because it is still red. Mm-hmm. And it is the only red major city left in the country, for that matter. When you think about the cities across the United States, most, in fact, pretty much all of them, the major cities certainly, places like L.A., Chicago, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Tampa Bay, all across the board. Tampa's kind of flip-flop a little bit. I think they may or may not have had a Republican once or twice in the last, 30 or 40 years. But Miami, you just go across the board. Just follow from Oregon in Washington, the Northwest on the seaboard, and follow it all the way. Trace the outline. You might have to cut through Mexico a little bit to get to the Gulf of Mexico, of course, but follow that. All those major cities are all blue. They're all run by blue mayors, blue councilmen, blue city council. And so Fort Worth is super interesting. Though it is red, it is still quite left leaning, pretty
It
like
is.
red liberal, if you will.
It is.
And so one would expect that if it is a red city and it is run by Republicans, that it would have a Republican policy put in place. There would be Republican policies. And look, I understand we're in this kind of day and age where things are compromised, and compromise means both sides give and take a little. That's not true. That's not what's happening. When we hear the word compromise from the left, we really mean give us everything you've got at gunpoint or we'll destroy you. And that's what it's boiled down to. And people I've been saying that since I served in the New Hampshire legislature. I got yelled at and cussed at. Now, most people know it at this point, but I digress on that point. Simply to say that from the school board in Fort Worth and the ISD to the city council, one would expect that being red, although I should slow down a little bit here and backtrack, the Fort Worth ISD isn't red. It is actually blue. And let's explain that. I think this needs to be broken down a little bit because this gets into kind of an election conversation that does need to, we've already addressed this a little bit in previous episodes, but I think it's important here. When we talk about partisanship or bipartisanship, or we say that a local election like the city council is not a partisan election, what's really being said is you don't have an R or D next to your name, meaning you're a Republican or Democrat. At least the ballot doesn't specify that. That is it, though, right, Carlos? That is it. All it means is we're not telling you whether or not they're Republican or Democrat, but we both know that matters today in our political climate. If you're a Republican city council member, that matters. If you're a Democrat city councilman, that really matters. And that's the way the cookie crumbles, as Bruce Almighty would say. So one of my favorite movies to quote. So when you're looking at that kind of political landscape, it makes a lot of sense that Fort Worth ISD, run by Democrats, Democrat Party has espoused every nasty thing you could possibly push forward. And you've been fighting for the better part of 2015, correct, is when you kind of got involved?
2017.
2017.
Yeah.
So you're going on shortly, in the next year or so, a decade of fighting this. And I think that's so important to bring up, because you've been fighting this for a decade, and my simple question to you in this moment is, has it gotten better or has it gotten worse?
I think it's gotten better.
Okay.
I think the culture has for sure changed a lot, because I know back in 2017, between 2017 and 2020, when COVID hit, that period was when there was much more activity for DEI duties. We had conferences in 4 or 5 of these summits, actually. The Racial Equity Committee Summit for 2018, for 2019. In 2020, they did a virtual summit online. And each summit would just grow. You have teachers. Most of them were ironically employees. Most of them were not even parents. It was just 4 or 5 of these staff members and teachers. School board members would attend. And during those summits, you would have a period where, all right, we're going to segregate into different races. So if you're white here, you go here. If you're black, you go here. And there were classrooms that were designated just for one race or another. And each classroom during that summit would talk about, the history of Egypt and how Black Americans, how Africans built pretty much everything. We went into that classroom, and it was just conspiracy theories, essentially.
Right.
It was insanity. You ultimately had very active groups such as My Brother's Keepers, My Sister's Keepers, Con Mi Madre, all of these youth groups where they would ultimately get young men of color. And that's how they would always say, we want young men of color to join My Brother's Keepers, which is an Obama organization that was created in 2014. And the original intent of that organization was to help elevate Blacks and Hispanic students that are struggling and not doing well by mentoring them and giving them the social skills and work skills to be successful in the workforce and to create a family and things like that. But that's not happening in Fort Worth ISD. Well, that hasn't happened in Fort Worth ISD. My Brother's Keepers would get, young students from high schools, and they would ultimately dedicate one lunch period every week,
Right.
For like an hour, and teach students, hey, we are fighting against systemic racism. We are
That's
fighting
ridiculous.
against, the white majority of this country. And I'll admit, I was actually a part of that club, because in 2017, 2018, I had no clue that My Brother's Keepers was this full-fledged left-wing organization. It wasn't until during, I would say a couple months in, that I realized, oh, this is pretty liberal.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think this is important. So I want to back up a little bit, and kind of just briefly explain, for those who are not really aware. I think everybody at this point probably is familiar with or has heard at some point in the last 10 years the term DEI. But the term itself stands for diversity, equity, inclusion. So, and you mentioned that at the beginning of the episode.
Yes.
But I think it's also important to perhaps point out briefly here why this is bad, even though those words are good, right?
Yes.
They typically, those words in the past would, who doesn't like a little bit of diversity in whatever they're doing? Even food. Like, you could look at something non-controversial as food. Well, I love diversity in food.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm not super adventurous with food. My wife and I have a disagreement on that. But diversity to people, equity tends to be a pretty good word. Inclusion is a great word. But when you put them together, and it becomes a political vehicle for a certain ideology to take its root in culture and in government, then it becomes a problem. So, Carlos, you've been in this. You've seen it. What do these words mean to the left?
Well, essentially to the left, it basically means, and I'm just going to be blunt, it means having less white people, having less Asian people, and lowering the standards. That's what it boils down to.
And lowering the standards for what exactly?
Test scores.
Okay, so in
performance
schools.
in schools, because it is racist for other groups of people to be a little bit more successful than other groups of people, and so therefore we need to lower the standard. So if the passing grade is 80, and for some reason another group of people are not reaching 80, then we need to lower that 80 to 50. And that's hurting everyone. That's been affecting
no doubt.
Corporate America. It's been affecting our schools. It's been affecting our universities. DEI is very detrimental for society in general. It's very racist, and it targets Asian Americans a lot. It targets white Americans. And during my time in Fort Worth ISD, most of the trainings that the racial equity department would conduct were mostly against white Americans, but even some Latinos that are just a little bit lighter skin were also affected, and even Asian Americans were affected.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting because, conservatives and Christians, which tend to be in the same group, historically in the last, I would say the last 50 years, I know we throw a lot of dates around in time frames, and that's not really explained. When I'm talking about the last 50 years, and I might even go back a little bit further than that, because oftentimes when we say 50, we're still thinking, oh, it's the year 2000, and it's not. We're in the year 2025, which is crazy for me to think that we're a quarter way through the century already. Wow. But simply to say, it's even further than that, actually. You could even go back 75 years. But when you go back to like the 1940s and 50s, you're going back to the decades in which prayer was taken out of the school. It's where the parents really didn't show up. Prayer was actually taken out, I believe, 1962, 1963. But even before that, Everson versus Board of Education, which really put down the jurisprudence and legal doctrine of separation of church and state. That's what really launched that. And so when you even go back, you can even look back before that, but you started to see the fruits of non-engagement from the churches and from the pastors, and it's a real problem. And so we're still seeing that today, and it's sad and it's scary. And so in the context of DEI, which I think a lot of people, again, are probably somewhat aware of, we're still seeing this happening in the school boards. So I want to bring it to both a national and a local level point of view, because as of, proud to say, as of this week, For Liberty and Justice now has gone national. We've launched in Hawaii. We're about to launch in Florida. So I am super excited about what God is doing in our nation and in our particular ministry. But this applies to everybody across, even Hawaii, and this applies to everybody. We've taken initiatives through SB 12, as you've said, to ban DEI. President Trump has signed executive orders, and I think Congress might be dabbling with the idea. They shouldn't even dabbling. They should be just doing.
Just get it done.
just get it ban done. It, get it out of the way. But that's what Trump is doing, is signing an executive order. We're trying to do things at the federal level to ban DEI. Here's the problem, though, with that. And it's not really a problem. It's just, I think it helps people, or it pushes people into a mode of complacency where people go, oh, well, if the law banned it, then I don't have any more work to do. I voted for you. You banned it. We're good to go. Bye. No. There's still a lot of work to be done, because, Carlos, you know this as well as I do, and anybody else who pays attention knows this. We have federal courts and school boards who are not listening to the law. Federal courts are not applying the law, and the school boards are not obeying the law. City councils are not obeying the law. I'll give everybody a really great example. Just a few months ago, they had the Council of Governors meet with President Trump. The governor of Maine, so funny. Governor of Maine said, I'll see you in court, because she was angry at Trump about the different policies he was being pushed, and she didn't like it. She's a leftist, and she's cuckoo, so she's gone. She's gone. Obviously, we believe in changing the heart, and we will continue to pray for her. But as far as her political viewpoint goes, it's still solid on the left side. And so she straight up told Trump, "Yeah, I'll see you in court. I'm not going to obey your dumb law." And Trump is like, "Well, okay, I'll see you back in court. Great. Good luck," and that's the point, right? Is that you've got governors all from the state level, because a governor is a state position. It is not a federally elected position. But from the top end of the state all the way down to the local level initiatives, you've got states that are not obeying the law, which brings up a completely different conversation that would be another fun one to have, about the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist, and how that was all flipped, and how the Federalists were trying to push a national government, and the states at the time were very, very powerful. And they were afraid that the states were going to ignore the federal level's policy, and now it's the flip. Now the states are the little man on the totem pole, and the federal government's this big monster, and it can do whatever it wants to do. So all that to say, Carlos, putting it back in your court here, since you've been involved with this, you're nearly a decade now, what would be what is your advice for people currently here in Tarrant County, Texas, across the state, Hawaii, Florida, wherever we're spreading out as For Liberty and Justice, but not just us, other organizations, churches, Christians, conservatives, even libertarians, Oh, heck, we just had the walk away movement a few years ago, and that's still running. Democrats who hear this episode are watching this, and they go, you know what, that makes sense. I totally agree. What is your advice to them? What is your guidance to them on how to begin to combat these ideologies in the classroom and in the cities?
Most important thing is to attend your school board meetings.
Hold on a second. You expect people to put down the Netflix for like 2 hours on an evening and show up to a school board meeting that they're paying their taxes to?
Yes.
Gotcha. Just want to make sure.
Go attend your school board meetings. Go attend the SHAC meetings, the committee meetings from that school board.
I don't mean to pause you again, but I do need explain what SHAC meeting is.
It's the Sexual Health Advisory Committee.
That sounds weird.
Most school districts have something like that. I know in 4 or 5 it's called SHAC. Most school districts, I would assume in Texas, have something called SHAC, but every state has something to some degree where the parents get to be a part of that committee and ultimately be able to advise, this is good sex health education, this is not good sex health education.
Gotcha. Okay.
Get involved in those committees. Go attend those meetings. Go attend those. If there's a DEI committee in your school district, go attend those committees and do public comment, or send emails to your school board members and get to know those school board members and figure out what's happening in the classroom. Do public records requests and figure out, what is happening in the classroom, what training is happening. And I will say this, 90% of DEI that is embedded in schools happens through professional development training. It does not happen through the classroom where, the teacher has, today we're going to be teaching critical race theory. If you do a FOIA and you search up critical race theory or diversity, equity, inclusion in this classroom, you will find nothing. But if you hit the
subliminal messaging, it's in the details.
Yeah, it's in the training. The teachers go and take the training. They learn about racial consciousness. They learn about implicit bias. They learn about white privilege and white guilt and all of this woke terminology. And then they go and apply it in the classroom, whether it be in English class or in science class or in history class. And you have to keep in mind that the teachers, some of them will be a little bit more aggressive. Mm-hmm. Some of them might not even do it whatsoever. Some of the teachers that are aggressive or might apply what they have learned will do an assignment all of a sudden in 2 weeks where, all right, we're going to learn about the history of racism in today's America. And then she might give a book list, and that list has, how to be an anti-racist.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
All of these left-wing books. And if you do a public records request searching up critical race or diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're not going to find it. But it's those little details that's how DEI is embedded in the classroom. So a science teacher might discuss about how the environment, there's racial inequities in the environment.
Right.
Where Black people might suffer more from pollution than Asian Americans or white people. And maybe that teacher does an assignment where they have to study the effects, and they cite, different links, and those links take you to left-wing websites or organizations.
I'm going to interject here.
Sure.
You're right about that, and I don't think people are aware of this, but this is even as deep, and it's really weird. For people who don't have a spiritual lens, it sounds cuckoo. For those of us who understand that the battle is spiritual, not political, we know that it is a spiritual thing, and that is this. You just said that there's it's claimed by the left that there are racial inequities in the environment, things like pollution. Mm-hmm. We've also heard recently in like the past few years that even rainstorms are hitting neighborhoods and flooding out neighborhoods. It's been reported by reporters will say, we're in a marginalized neighborhood where the rain is battering down on this particular neighborhood and with historic rainfall. Yep. Number one, usually that's not true. That's not even historic rainfall, but it's just a ploy. And it's also the fact that it's not true and they're still pushing it, it makes it even more weird because at the very least, you would want it to be true so that it bolsters your argument, because your argument already sounds a little strange in the first place. You're saying that the rain god came down and put a cloud over your neighborhood from Beach Street to Tree Street
because of your
and
color.
Said, because we've got 563 black people in this neighborhood and a couple of Hispanics, we're going to make sure we rain down on you so hard that when you walk outside, you're going to need a paddle boat. But the white neighborhood next to you, tweet, rain is gone, no cloud over it. It's that silly. Okay. And so I think that's important to point out because we've already talked a little about climate change on a couple different episodes, but that it's not just about, oh, you're black, you're white. We've got problems with skin color, because you're white and you can't help it. And you see this black person and you're racist because you exist. It's worse than that. It's like, it's weird, spiritual, demonic stuff that's happening and it's embedded in their heart and people have chosen this stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to push back. I would even say that people need to get radical. I'm not also talking about going and flipping a car in the street like the left. They love doing that. They like seeing things burn. They're like pyromaniacs, right? But I am saying that, in fact, when I say radical, I don't even necessarily mean doing crazy stunts or anything like that. I just mean get out of your comfort zone. Put
Yes.
down the TV remote
Yes.
once in a while. Like, give up certain things in your week to make sure that the future for you and your children, especially your children, is secured. We see that in the preamble of the Constitution. For ourselves and our posterity, that is future generations. The founding fathers weren't just fighting for their own country that they had right then and there, the ones they were building. They were fighting for a future generation. They were fighting for their children and their grandchildren and their great-great-grandchildren 250 years from now, which is where we are today. And I think that's so important. We don't think like that. In fact, that's what the Bible even says. A number of different kings, right? You had kings that would come up and they would say, well, as long as it's not in my lifetime, and that's a very selfish way of looking at it. But we have to, coming back to the DEI side of it, it's even as bad as when the left looks at somebody and they say, hey, you're a white guy. The fact that you are white and born that way makes you a racist automatically. You can't help it. But yet we're going to try and help you realize it. Well, if I'm white and I can't help that I'm racist, then what do you do? It's like, it's a weird argument because they say the same thing about homosexuality. They say you're born gay. Okay, well, I try and change you. You don't want it. But then, you're trying to change me. You claim I'm racist inherently. And so, well, if I'm born that way, if being born a certain way to me would mean that you can't change it, so just accept me the way I am. So if somebody's gay and they're born that way and homosexual, if I'm born racist, then why can't I just be that way? Just let me be. I'm born that way. I can't help it. But one is hurtful. And it really is, by the way. I put that quotations, I say, because racism is actually hurtful, but it's learned. It's not born, right? And the same for homosexuality. We're born into sin. So there are going to be people predisposed to it, right? Because they are born in a harmful household that may invite that spirit in. But you're not born homosexual. You're born into sin. And so we have to break that off of us by choosing to serve Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior.
Yes.
And so that, I think, is the approach that we need to be taking. We first need to be praying, but then we need to be pushing back against this spirit of division. And there's spiritual solutions, and then there are political solutions. Spiritual come first, political comes second. So I'm glad Carlos, you said something earlier, though, about how you see the tide turning. Can you explain in like 2 or 3 ways the things that you are seeing the tide turn, as far as like the Fort Worth ISD or the cities getting better or worse? And I mean, you said they were getting better, so I kind of want to kind of flesh that out a little bit, what that looks like in reality.
Well, I'll answer that, but I also want to, pitch into the spiritual side of things and how actually this has become a little bit worse over the years, even though now with President Trump and with Christian conservatives getting involved, there's been a pushback, and we've seen some improvements in some areas. But I know in Fort Worth ISD, the racial equity department is pretty much non-existent. There's no racial equity director anymore. The committee still exists. However, the committee is a shell of what it used to be. Right. Because they don't do summits anymore. They don't do conferences. They don't do all of these big, expensive projects. They used to have a $2.2 million budget, the department, and that's no longer there. So there's been a lot of improvements. Now, of course, there's still some DEI embedded where it's like super hidden, yes, in some cases. But compared to the 2017 through 2020 era, it's a major improvement, I will say. Good. And if the fact that the ISD is already talking about how they need to remove DEI to comply with the federal government is also another sign that things are slowly improving. Right. But to go back, since you were talking about the spiritual side of things, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, well, I would say 80 years ago, the Marxists and the left realized that they can't conquer America through class warfare because America is a middle-class economy. The vast majority are comfortable with the materials that they have, with the housing that they have, with the protection that they have, unlike the countries like the Soviet Union or in China, where in those two countries you had revolutions or civil war where The peasants were uprising because they couldn't even feed their families.
Right.
They had significant poverty levels, unlike the West. And because they had such a major poverty issue in those countries and major corruption and just social decay in general, the communists were able to take over those countries through class warfare. In America, the communists could not do that because even the poorest Americans, you see them somewhat obese. They're not.
That's true.
They're not
starving.
They're not starving. They're
Right.
they're still comfortable, even though it's a
Sure.
little bit annoying that they don't have such a high income like the other Americans. They still are not. They're not like in sub-Saharan Africa or in parts of China where they're having to live in little sheds. So what they did is they replaced class warfare with racial warfare, where the struggle isn't between the rich and the poor, it's between the minority population against the majority population. And so that's ultimately what they have been embedding in America. And you've seen, unfortunately, the side effects of that ideology playing out.
Mm-hmm.
LA, where you saw riots happening against ICE, and that is the Latino side has been indoctrinated in believing that they must embrace their racial identity and their Mexican nationalism and not assimilate into America whatsoever. And so that's why you had riots in LA. Black Lives Matter in 2020, when you had riots across the country, and the idea was, well, the police are systemically racist. We must burn down the police. We must kill officers. That is the side effect of critical race theory, of DEI in a nutshell, because when you keep promulgating this notion to minority populations that they are oppressed, they don't have the same rights as the majority population, which is white Americans, they are poorer than the majority population. Any issues that you have in life or in society, and you're in the minority population, the excuse that the left created was, well, just blame it on the white individual because look what happened 200 years ago or 300 years ago. And they weaponize history. That's the other factor that people need to know, is that history has been weaponized. And that's the reason why you see some of these minority groups, not all, but people within those groups, still use racial warfare when it comes to politics, when it comes to life, when it comes to, society.
Yes.
And you've seen that over the past couple of years. You saw in Ferguson in 2014. You saw it with the LA riots in 1992. You've seen it in some states where they're now trying to push reparations and get taxpayers to pay for, the sins that were committed in the past. I mean, I don't think you should be paying reparations, or I should be paying reparations for individuals that are long dead, 5 generations ago.
Right. Well, this also gets to a principle in kind of the Old Testament where the sons are not punished for their father's sins.
Yes.
And so that, I think that goes to a really good point, but that's a discussion for another day. Unfortunately, we don't have the time for that. But Carlos, thank you for coming on. Perhaps down the road we'll do a part 2 of this because there's a lot to flesh out.
There's a lot.
It's a ton, and there are constant updates too.
Definitely.
But with that said, man, I'm so glad all of y'all joined in to check out this episode. Please share it, like the button, subscribe on our YouTube channel, our Spotify, all the things like I talked about at the beginning of the episode. But get out there and be aware of what's going on and fight for your communities, because your kids and your grandkids depend on it. Till next time.
Hey, thanks so much for watching the For Liberty and Justice podcast, where we seek to mobilize the church, wake up the city, and take a stand for liberty and justice in the governmental realm. Hey, look, we'd love for you to follow us on all of our social media at For Liberty and Justice. Subscribe to the podcast, share it with a friend. And if you're looking to get involved, we'd love for you to either launch a chapter or join a chapter in your local area so we can keep fighting for liberty and justice together. You can do that by going to forlibertyandjustice.us and signing up today. Let's keep fighting to mobilize the church, wake up the city, and take a stand for liberty and justice together.